Perfect. Okay, so it looks as though we are live. If you are joining us live, can you please let me know? Just let me know that you're here by giving us a little like or a comment, say hi. Let us know that you are here. If you're watching us on replay, give us a hashtag replay, and that way we can tell that you're watching, and both Fiona and I will be looking back at the comments and we'll be commenting, replying to your comments as and when they come in. So I'll just make sure that that we do have eyes on us. So I'm just waiting for somebody to let us know, and then hopefully we'll be able to start. So yeah, do just give us a little like so that I know that we can continue, because otherwise we'll be talking to ourselves. It'd be particularly great.
And if you've got any questions, please do just put them in the chat and we will try and answer as many as we can. We're hoping for lots of questions today.
Yeah, definitely. Right. So, hey, there we are. Brilliant. People can see us. So I am absolutely thrilled that today I am joined by Fiona. And I'll let you introduce yourself, Fiona.
Okay, so I'm Fiona and I run Mills Tutoring. I have done a live before on this group, so this is my second one. I've been helping children prepare for 11 plus assessments for independent and grammar schools for the past 10 years, as well as helping parents support their children and choose secondary schools. I'm based in London, and so most of my students are looking at schools in and around London, but I have tutored children all over the UK and internationally. I also work as a lawyer for a media company. I trained as a solicitor in London and I worked in law firms for a few years in London, Singapore and Sydney. And now I do the tutoring part-time and the lawyering part-time.
Which sounds very, very busy. Hopefully anyone who's joining us is probably aware of who I am. I pop up a lot on these videos, but my name is Gemma Zoe Smith and I run the Education Hotel. And the Education Hotel helps students from ages 6 all the way up to 18, but usually looking at exam points. So we do the 11 plus, 13 plus, 16 plus, as well as GCSEs and A levels. I think I've probably tutored about as long as Fiona, and again, mainly I focus on top selective schools. So for grammar, we're talking about things like QE or TEFNs, kind of really selective, and then the independent's fairly similar as well. But likewise, again, used to be in London, now I'm in Oxford, but we mostly focus our 11 plus kind of around London, Reading, looking at those types of areas. But again, with the Education Hotel, we have tutors who are all over the UK as well as online, so we do worldwide stuff as well. All right, and today we are both here to talk to you about English. So I think 2 weeks ago I was here talking about raising your scores in math, and I'm back, but I brought somebody with me to talk about English, which is useful because personally as a tutor, I typically focus on the math, I focus on the verbal and non-verbal, but not so much the English. I have tutors who focus on the English, not me. So it's great to be joined by Fiona, who really knows her stuff when it comes to English. And today what we're going to be talking about is that kind of common areas of struggle. So you might be watching this as a Year 5 parent, and you might be thinking, okay, we've got a month and a couple of days until 11 plus. How do we really boost those scores? Just a couple of marks. Or you might be watching as a Year 4 parent and thinking, how do we think ahead? Like, what do we need to be doing as it gets to this time next year? And so we had a quick chat, and these are the areas where Fiona and I feel like it's probably the kind of common areas of struggle. Obviously, there are different ones for different pupils, and some of you might be reading this thinking, yep, one of those is very much my child, and we're going to go through each of those. Before we move on, Fiona, anything you want to say?
No, do you think so?
No. Okay. Main common areas of struggle for my pupils tends to be speed and that'll be too slow or too fast. Inference in comprehension, and we talk a lot about comprehension typically in the group, and inference comes up a lot. And the reason that inference comes up is it's somewhat the harder part of the comprehension. It's not pulling things straight out of the text. So we'll go through a little bit about inference. Lackluster creative writing. So Fiona's going to talk to us about how to really boost your vocab, to boost your grammar, to make sure everything is really nice and crisp and high scoring. One of the things, again, that my pupils bring up is getting stuck. So as you start to get onto the really complex comprehensions, what happens if you get stuck? It's a bit of a worry for a lot of parents. So what if my child just gets to the middle of a text and doesn't understand what they're doing? We can talk about that. And then confidence, because I think, as we say quite a lot on the 11 plus journey, confidence can really make a difference in terms of marks. And I think we probably both, Fiona and I, are both familiar with the importance of going into an exam feeling confident and really feeling like you know what you're doing, whether that be in jobs as well. You really need to be confident, especially as a lawyer. You've got to be really confident about what you do.
And I think confidence is built as children. So if we can get our children feeling confident now and getting them using different strategies of how to overcome problems, then they're likely to be more successful when they get into secondary school, and then also when they get into jobs as adults.
All right, so as we said, if you do have questions, do pop them in the chat, because we'll have some time at the end to talk about them. But if we first of all go to speeding up and slowing down, this is our issues over speed. And again, regardless of whether you're a year 4, if you're a year 4 parent moving into year 5 and you are thinking of putting your child into doing some practice papers, maybe starting with 10-minute papers, moving up to like a 30-minute, you're going to come across this issue. You might be a year 5 going into year 6 parent and find that this is quite a common issue. Usually a child will fall into one of two camps. Either typically they won't be finishing, so they are a little bit on the slow side, meaning that they might not get through to the questions at the end, and that could mean not finishing the paper or rushing through and really just giving a guess for the last, say, 5 or 6. Or it could be that they really rush the paper, they've got a lot of time at the end, but they struggle to check, and that means that they really need to slow down a little bit. So if you've got a child who is really rushing, and often this comes about because they started off slower and they needed to speed up, and what's happened is they've slightly overshot it, and they're now rushing through the paper. They're finding that they've got a lot of time, but when they go back, it might not be changing anything, might not be checking effectively, or might be checking something and then changing the things that they actually got right the first time, because that often causes a bit of doubt, especially in English. I think in math it can sometimes be easier to see where you've made a mistake. With English it can be a little bit harder, and often when it comes to comprehensions, I tend to find that you can do some elimination. So elimination like you would do with like VR or non-VR, but then there might be 2 or 3 answers. And 2 or 3 answers, that typically is the point where if I'm watching a student do an exam, I will see that they'll make a guess. And so they'll go, definitely not this one, definitely not this one, if it's multiple choice. But then they've got 3 to choose from, 3 kind of similar answers, and then they might just pick one. So that would be the point where I'd start working with the child to make sure that those 3 answers are actually being considered. So it's great that we've narrowed it down to 3, 1 in 3 chance, but can we narrow it down any further? Can we really think about each answer, as opposed to just going, okay, I've got rid of 2 definite no's, but now I'm going to just make a guess. And often that comes up for my students in English, because we prepare on maybe longer answers, because one of the things that we like to do is kind of take students out of their comfort zone and into longer answer questions for comprehension. And then when they get to multiple choice, they feel like it should be much quicker. So if you do have a student, you have a child who is really rushing, do make sure that when they are going through the answers, they're not just getting rid of the 2 definite no's and then making a guess between the 3, that they really are considering each of those options. And the other part of that kind of rushing is, it's great to have the time at the end to check, but making sure that they are checking effectively. Sometimes I've come across students who will check and who will actually end up remarking the wrong answers. So they previously got it right, but then they've gone through and they feel like they have to change something because they're checking. And that means that they might doubt themselves, and then they might end up doing the question again and maybe deciding that it's a different answer, but actually the previous one was correct. So with checking, it tends to be, for my pupils anyway, making sure that the right questions are being checked. So if you consider it a comprehension, whether you've got 1, whether you've got 2, as per some of the more recent changes or kind of adaptations, we've got certain questions that maybe your child wasn't so sure on, and I think most people will circle if they don't know. So making sure that they're going back to the ones that they definitely weren't certain on, and making sure that those are the ones that they are looking at before they start to check the rest. Because if you're checking the rest, you might be changing things that actually you were pretty certain on the first time. So that checking, you can go further. If you've got a lot of time that is left over, then you can circle if you're not sure, and I sometimes put a question mark if there was between 2, and that way you go back to the circles, see about the circles, go back to the question marks, see about the question marks, then maybe look down. Yeah, and lots of people are saying when you narrow it down, you'll go for the wrong answer. So it's like 1 between 2, and you're not certain. You need to slow down a little bit with those. It's typically just because they found that it's 1 of 2, and then they just go for 1. And they don't necessarily think about what answer that could be, and really put some time into it. Obviously not too much time, because we're making sure that it's within time, but making sure that they really have considered the answers, not just narrowing it down and then guessing between 2. I don't know if you've got any further comments on that, Fiona, on those.
Not really. I think I was going to say that I think it's useful to have, a couple of levels of ones where, maybe they're really, really not sure. So those are the first ones they go back to. And then ones where they're, if they've got time, they then go back to those other ones. So with the question mark and the circling, I think that's a really good idea, because sometimes there'll just be a couple of questions where, they really did have to guess, and you really want them to go back and check those ones. And then there's ones where, they're pretty sure, but they're just not as 100% sure. And we want to make sure that they're checking those in the right order.
Yeah, definitely. And also making sure that they know where they're not sure, because often something that if we've been teaching, okay, circle if you're really not sure, putting in that extra level, as you said, can be useful for a child, because then they can think in their mind, they can prioritize, and they can say, okay, well, this is one that I wasn't maybe 100%, so I'm not just going to whiz past it and go, yep, I've got the right answer. I am actually going to sit and think about it for a little bit. The opposite of this is the needing to speed up part. So this, again, I've got students who hit this at maybe a month or so to go. They're spending a bit too long on the paper, and they're not finishing. They've got 5 or 6 questions at the end. And if you're talking multiple choice, those 5, 6 questions at the end are worth the same as the ones that they are spending all the time on. And it is usually a reminder of that. So if you are doing a multiple choice paper where everything is worth 1 mark, and your child is spending 2-3 minutes on one specific question, well, that's 2-3 minutes at the end of the paper that they might actually be getting, and it might be the easier questions, the ones that they find easier at the end. And if they rush it, might be making silly mistakes. So with those, again, it's a circle, come back, but it's also encouraging them to make that educated guess. So narrow down, select, move on, but make sure you know you're coming back to it. And one of the things as a parent that I think you can do is to start to look at the ones that your child is circling and see, is it always a specific type of question that they're circling? And if you're looking at it with them together, why did they circle that question? Was it that they were really uncertain on what the question meant? Was it that they really weren't certain of one or two of the answers? Maybe there's some words in there that they don't understand. Maybe it was that several of the answers sounded like they could have fitted. But if you can start to understand why it is that they have circled those, then you can start to put a bit of time into tackling that style of question. So if you're looking and you're seeing, okay, everything that they're circling, all of it is to do with vocabulary, then that shows that maybe you need to work on the vocab. Or, you know, everything that they're looking at is to do with the emotion of a character. Then again, you can look at how is that character feeling. You can look at focusing on that in your revision. And so making sure that that you, when you're circling, you're going back and you're looking together, because you are a team for doing 11 plus, you and your child, and making sure that you can understand with them, how is it that they can speed up, and how is it that if they're speeding up and they're circling it, then why are they circling it? Why is it taking them that long? So often when it gets to the point, if a student's spending too long on a paper, what I'll do with English is I'll split it. So I will split it into, if you've got close and comprehension, or you've got creative writing, comprehension, you split the paper and assign each part of it different times. So say it says on the front of the paper that the comprehension is due to take 20 minutes and the creative writing is also due to take 20 minutes, then split it and send them out as two separates and see where they need to be. Or if you're going to do a 40-minute, have a timer that goes off at 20 minutes and see where they are. So is it that the comprehension is taking just a bit too long? Is it that they've actually rushed the comprehension, they've ended up on the creative writing at 20 minutes, and actually that's a different problem, but you couldn't tell because as far as you're concerned, they're not finishing the paper. So really segment the paper and find out where they're spending too long, and then just tackle those specific areas, so those specific circles. Again, is there anything that you'd want to add, Fiona?
I was just going to say about children that are just generally a little bit slow. Sometimes I find that it's just that they're generally a bit slow and we just need to kind of speed up their sense of urgency. And I sometimes find that things can help. Sort of things that can help are, you know, timing them at everyday tasks. So, you know, if it's getting ready in the morning or just putting stuff in their bag, or just to give them a sense of, you know, how long things take and trying to speed up a little bit. Because I think sometimes you can work with children, you can think, I know you can do this faster, but you're just not trying to do it faster. So I think, you know, maybe trying with some other tasks, because it can be a bit overwhelming if they're constantly timed everything to do with the 11 plus, and then working with them on questions and working out exactly, if you do it with them, working out exactly, okay, where could you have gone a little bit faster on this?
Yeah, I think one of the other things, again, I know that some parents are really wary of this, but I like to do papers alongside my students. And part of the reason is that it tells me where they're typically slowing down, because I can tell versus my pacing, but it also tends to encourage them to speed up a little bit because they see somebody else moving through. And often that motivates them to try and get a bit quicker. I suppose it actually reminded me with kind of that students maybe are a bit slower elsewhere, and do think about distractions. So if your child is slow and it just happens to be in the summer, is that there's a lot of noise? Is that they're struggling because there's a giant window out front of them and they can see their siblings playing football? And that's not that they're slow, that's that they're distracted, and that's a different thing altogether. All right, Perfect. So we've got a couple of people who've been talking in the chat. Lots of people saying, yep, that when their child's going through, that the ones that they get wrong are the ones that they've circled. But that is what we would expect ultimately, because those are the ones that they weren't sure on. What we're just advocating is going back to maybe a circled, maybe a star. Someone says stars, question marks, making that there is a level of what's to go back on. But ultimately, as a tutor, I would expect the circled ones to be the most wrong, because those are the ones that a child has said, I'm not sure on the answer. So therefore that they're more likely to get those incorrect. But it is about them knowing that they can go back to them, especially if they've rushed through the paper and they've got time spare, then going back and really focusing on those.
And in terms of using stars and using circles, I would say just make sure that your child knows what they're going to use before they start, make sure it's consistent, and just do something that's quick, the quickest thing that they can do, so that they're not wasting time drawing pictures next to whatever their questions are.
Yeah, exactly. Making sure that they know that, okay, circles what I go back to first, and question marks I go back to if I've got time. That is useful, because then they're not just going through the paper going, oh, there's a mark here and I don't know what that necessarily means. Another people of mine used to fold over the page if they didn't know, they knew they wanted to go back to, because then they just had to go to where the folded page was and be able to look at it. But I think if you're circling maybe one per page, it's probably not worth it. So it's kind of each individual for a child. Typically, when we go through those circles, we find out that a large amount of it might be inference. And inference comes up a load on the 11+ journey. And just quickly, I suppose I wanted to go through some tips with inference. We're in the summer holidays, so we've got a little bit more time to spend on inference, and really inference, I've heard it described by other tutors as kind of being a detective, which is really true. It's finding out in the passage what did they mean but they didn't say. And so I like to ask my pupils to do that elsewhere. So to do it whilst they're reading, I'll say, oh, what did that character want? What was their main goal during that football match? What do they really want to do? Okay, how can you tell? What type of language did they use? I do the same in summer holidays. So one of the best things I like to do with residential students is to sit down in a cafe and people watch. And it's really useful, because what we say is, when we're sitting down, we'll sit down and we'll have a cup of tea. And typically we'll talk about exams and we'll talk about technique, but we'll also watch people and we'll say, what do you reckon that person's doing? How can you tell? Oh, they're in a rush. How can you tell they're in a rush? Well, they're walking really quickly. What would you use? What word would you use? Brisk. Okay. So if you're walking briskly, then maybe you're running late. And what about that person? Oh, they're shopping. How can you tell? They've got lots of bags. So really you're using that inference in day-to-day life. So really putting yourself into a character's shoes and putting yourself into a story means that when they see those types of interactions, they can then think about, oh, okay, I've seen this type of thing before. And other things that we do is we discuss why certain words or certain literary devices are used. So, for example, you wouldn't use raining cats and dogs in a horror, because it's a bit too jovial. It's a bit of a funny phrase. You wouldn't use it on something that was really serious. Instead, you might say that there was drizzle, or you might say something else. You might say that the sky was gloomy. You wouldn't use it if you were trying to be kind of a dark theme of writing. Likewise, if you wanted to describe a character as towering, you can think about what does that make if you looked up and somebody was towering above you, is that a happy image, or is that something that's maybe a bit scary? And once you start to think about how the words are used and how the phrases are used, then you can put those into text. So that's the bit that often when we teach vocab, we teach, that Toward means one thing. but we don't necessarily think about why it might be used, or why you might use a certain simile, or why you might use a certain metaphor. So over the summer, start to think about people you see. You know, how would you describe the postman? How would you describe your siblings? How would you describe them? And why would you use certain types of words? Why would you use certain types of literary devices? What does that tell you about their mood? And again, then put it back into 11 plus. And that tends to help with the inference. They tend to be able to then link that to something that you might have seen or read or understood. So really practice putting your child into the character's shoes, and really working out why the author might have chosen to write using specific words or literary devices. Anything else, Fiona?
I was just going to say that I often find with my students that it's useful to do inference questions with very short text if they're struggling. So particularly if you're doing standard format rather than multiple choice, often the inference type questions come at the end of the comprehension where there's more marks, and they've already had 20-30 minutes of answering lots of other questions, and so then they get to the end, they may be running out of time, and then they've got to a 4 or 5 marker where they have to think a little bit more. And if they struggle with those types of questions, I sometimes find students will only write, a couple of lines, and they won't get all the marks. And so what I found helpful is to find very short passages where it's maybe not clear what's going on, and then just kind of, even you can even do it out loud, or just writing, what's going on here, trying to think about the characters, trying to think about what literary devices have been used, why have they been used, in just one short paragraph. Doing a few of those can get your child into kind of the swing of answering those inference type questions, rather than throwing them in at the deep end with these papers where they tend to have a slightly longer passage, and then they've got to answer lots and lots of questions on that passage before they get to the inference questions.
Definitely. I always say to my students, imagine me behind you going, why? So why? Because often for inference, they'll say, oh, this happened, but why? Like, why can you tell that? How can you tell that? Just tell me. And I'm always trying to say to them, why? Why is it that you think this? Like, what is there in the text that suggests it? Why? And that again is trying to get them to write a little bit more than maybe those couple of sentences for the standard answers. Definitely. So I think, yeah, inference is a skill to work on, definitely, and it's a skill that can be really focused on over summer, I think. All right. So upgrading creative writing, over to you.
So the first thing that I just want to point out was just reading. I'm sure this is an obvious one, but trying to get your child to read as much as possible. Obviously, the more they read, the easier they're going to find coming up with their own stories. Try and encourage them to choose their own books as much as possible. There might sometimes be books that you would like them to read, but we want children to be enthusiastic about what they're reading, and the more enthusiastic they are, the more likely they're going to want to do it. So they're going to do it more frequently. So we really want to encourage our children to build an enjoyment of reading, get them to go to bookshops or libraries and pick their own books, talk to them a lot about what they're reading, build it into their routine, and then discuss the books with them. Ask them to summarize different sections. I mean, this can help with comprehension as well, but if they say read for 20 minutes before they go to bed, ask them what's happened, ask them to tell you about the characters, what the character's personality is, their feelings, ask them to describe the atmosphere of the setting. Just talk to your children about what they're reading, and about what you're reading as well. In terms, someone's just asked, which types of books do you think they should read? I mean, we ideally want them to read a range of different books, but I think particularly if they're reluctant to start with, we just want them to be reading what they want to read, and then we can kind of build them up to more difficult texts. There are a lot of lists. If you're looking at what sort of books you want them to be reading, there are lots of 11 plus lists that you can find online. But I think to start with, we just want to make sure they're reading what they want to read, and even if you're trying to encourage them to read more challenging books, we want to make sure that they are also getting to read what they want to read as well, because we don't want them to put them off. in terms of particular sets, yeah, look at the list online. You can get 11 plus books, but I do think they should be reading a wide variety.
Yeah, I'd say in terms of, also you can audiobook sometimes. So I know that a lot of children get really tired reading quite quickly. So again, to feed that interest, audiobook and follow along in the book. So if you're on a long journey and they get car sick, get on an audiobook for something, and again, pause the audiobook and ask questions around it. It's not as good, but ultimately it's something that will help when we're on summer holidays.
And I think particularly for creative writing, you know, audiobooks are still going to stimulate their imagination, and that's what we really, really need for their creative writing. And I think it's good to talk to your children, you know, when they're halfway through a book or when they're coming towards the end of a book, speak to your child about what might happen next. You know, I think a lot of children struggle with how to end their story, and their story might come to quite an abrupt end. And talking to your child about, you know, the different options and then seeing how it actually ends can be something that can help them kind of come up with different endings themselves. The next thing is to start small. So if you've got a child who just doesn't want to write, and I think particularly if you haven't done a lot of practice and you suddenly start doing papers and they've got half an hour to do a creative writing and they haven't had a lot of practice, it's a bit overwhelming, and often I find children are just like, I can't, you know, they just don't want to sit down and do it. So I think the first thing to do is to start small. Don't expect them to just sit down for half an hour and write an entire story. I think the first thing to do is to make up stories together out loud. And this is something that I recommend doing with, you know, children when they're very young. Make up stories together, you know, add a little bit, get them to add a bit. The next thing I would do is use pictures and videos and real life settings to stimulate your child's imagination. So I use Once Upon a Picture, the website, quite a lot with my students, and I will share my screen and get them to pick which picture they want to write about, because ultimately they're going to be more enthusiastic if it's a picture that they like. If you've been on holiday or you've been for a day trip and you've taken pictures, you know, use those pictures and get them to write a story based on that picture. And I think when they start doing the creative writing, start small. So just get them to do a paragraph and see if they can, you know, do one paragraph describing the setting, describing the atmosphere. And once they've done that, then, you know, you might then want to build up to 2 paragraphs where you bring in the characters and think about their personality, their appearance and their feelings. And once they've got into the hang of it and they kind of know what they're doing and the sorts of things that they should include, it's then not such an ordeal, and they're going to find it easier to write a few more paragraphs. And I think with this, it's little and often, because you don't want it to become an activity to dread. So, you know, build it up, do it regularly, and try and encourage them to kind of come up with a structure that they can always use. The other thing I'd say is if your child is quite reluctant, try not to critique every sentence. You know, it can be quite difficult not to say, oh, you can make this better, you can make this better, which is what we want, but don't do it too much if your child is very reluctant. We just want to get them writing. In terms of, you know, if you've got them writing and you're thinking, oh, I think they can do better, they can come up with better words, better description, think about different resources you can use. So lots of children have the Descriptosaurus, which is a good start if your child is struggling with description. And there are specific creative writing books out there that can help with that. It kind of helps children to improve using all the senses and to show, not tell, to use more exciting verbs and more precise adjectives, and kind of more relevant literary devices. The other thing I'd say is make sure your child knows different literary devices and is clear that they need to be using them. So I use acronym SOAP-HIM and get children to write it down at the beginning, and they can tick off which ones they've used. The same with sentence structures. Make sure your child is aware of different sentence structures that they need to use in their writing, and try and make sure that they mix them up a little bit in their creative writing. The next thing I would do is ensure that your child has a structure for their writing and they get used to planning. So you know, it's very difficult to start a story with a blank page. So if you've got a structure that your child is going to use for every single creative writing that they do, and they know the first thing that they write down is this structure and their plan, it kind of gets them writing, gets something down on paper, and then it's easier to start. I have children, they write their structure and then they can tick things off. And if they've planned it properly, it means that they've got less time. You know, they spend less time thinking whilst they're writing because they've already done the thinking part, and they can go back to their plan and they can think about what they need to include rather than having to think about everything all at the same time. And the last thing is,
just to be clear,
go ahead.
When you say structure, just because I know that some of my parents say, does that mean you work the same story? But we don't mean write the same story when we say make sure that you've got the same structure. If you just
no. Make sure that you know how many paragraphs you're writing, make sure you know what literary devices you're going to try and include, make sure you've thought about your vocabulary, make sure you've thought about your sentence structures. In terms of writing the same story, we don't want children writing the same story, but I think it is important to think for children to realise that they can reuse some of their ideas. So if they've come up with a really good sentence, or they've come up with a really good opening, or they've got a really good literary device or something they've used previously, they can use it again. We don't want them using it every single time they write a story, but the more they practice, the easier it's going to become, and the more they can think about what they've written. They can kind of take ideas from what they've read, and they can reuse those ideas when it comes to the exam. So it's not, they don't go into the exam thinking, oh, I've never done this before, I need to come up with an entirely new story with an entirely new setting. They can think about ones that they've previously done and use some of those ideas.
Yeah, I say to my students,
Yeah, I'm struggling to hear you as well, Gemma. I just took my headphones out because I thought it was maybe my headphones. Can everyone hear me okay? Can someone just post if you can hear me? How strange. Oh, you can hear me. Okay, so it must be Gemma then. Okay, Gemma, do you want to go on the next slide while you try and get your mic working? And I'll cover widening vocabulary while Gemma tries to get her mic working. So the first thing I'd say is start early. So I think vocabulary is the most difficult thing to start late. So that's not something you want to cram towards the end. There are some other aspects of the 11 plus that are slightly easier to do later on when you're closer to the exam, but vocabulary isn't one of them. It needs to be built over a long period of time. So try and start as early as you can with this. The first thing I'd say is try to include sophisticated vocabulary in your speech. So when you're talking to your children, try. Oh, I can hear you now, Gemma. I think that's working.
Okay.
It's just a little bit of feedback. Can you say hello and I'll see if I can hear you?
I don't think people can hear me.
Oh yeah, no, we can hear you now. Oh, I can. Can everyone else hear Gemma?
Oh. Okay.
Well, I'll keep going because I can hear Gemma now. so hopefully everyone else can. So as I was saying, just try and use sophisticated language when you're talking to your children, you know, when you're in the car, when you're at home. The more you use words that are new to them, the more it will kind of go in by osmosis, and hopefully they will start using those words. I would encourage your child to start a vocabulary book if they don't have one already. So, you know, keep the notebook next to whatever book they're reading, and encourage them to write down new words, both from what they're reading, from words that they hear in everyday life, from anything from television, from anything, any new words that come up. If they write them down in their vocabulary book. In terms of looking them up, obviously, you may not want to always be looking at words in the dictionary while they're reading, because it kind of disrupts it. But I would recommend that once when they go back to their vocabulary book, they do look up all the words in an actual dictionary rather than online. It kind of helps them, you know, with other skills that are going to help them with their 11 plus. Check their pronunciation of the words. See if they can find the root of the words. So when they've got these new words, they look them up in the dictionary, see if there's a root. So an example would be, you know, ambi means both. So that will help them work out what ambidextrous means, what ambiguous means, what ambivalent means. And, you know, that will, when words come up in the 11 plus, often it's words that they can kind of look at the core word, the root word, and then they can work out, oh, I know another word that's very similar. Maybe I can guess what the meaning is. When they are looking at words in the dictionary and they've looked at the root word, think about synonyms and antonyms. There might be some new words when they look up synonyms and antonyms. There might be some other new words in there that they can add to their list. And synonyms and antonyms do come up a lot in the 11 plus. Do encourage your children to write down words within a sentence. So it's really important that they understand the context. You often find that students maybe learn a long list of new words and they do know the meaning, but they don't know the precise meaning. So then when they use it in their creative writing, it's just slightly out of context. It doesn't quite fit. So it's important that your child knows exactly what the precise meaning is so that they can use it properly in its context. You know, once your child has learnt some new words, challenge them to use them in everyday life, because that will then really tell you whether they really understand what it means and if they're using it in the right context. If they're not using it in the right context, then you can correct them and you can go back to the meaning and you can come up with some new sentences with it in the correct context. Other ways that you can come up with new words is, you know, when your child is reading comprehension passages, you know, read them out loud, get them to pick out words from the passage that they don't know, or if you think there are any words in there that they don't know, ask them what they mean. Sometimes I find that children, I'll pick up a word and I say, do you know what that means? Like, yeah, I know, I definitely know what that means. And then you ask them to give you another sentence with it in, and they don't actually really know what it means, even though they think they do. So I think it's worth asking them what they don't understand, but also you picking out a few words and seeing if they understand them. Cover all words that come up in any books or test papers that they're doing. You know, a good way to build a good 11 plus vocabulary list is to just, you know, if they're doing the bond papers or CGP papers, or they're doing the, you know, they're further on and they're actually doing actual papers. If there are any words that come up that they're getting wrong, write them in their vocabulary book. Revisit them really, really regularly. So again, little and often is best. These words will only long-term memory if they, you know, look at them, have a bit of a break, look at them again, have a longer break, look at them again. So if you learn a new word on a Monday, you might go over it again on a Tuesday, then you might leave it for a couple of days, go over it again on a Thursday, and then you might leave it to say the following Monday or Tuesday, and that will give it time to go into their long-term memory. Don't do lots and lots of learning new words. Don't ever sit there for 30 minutes learning new words. It's better to do 10 minutes on 6 days a week than do 60 minutes all on one day. This is very much the task that needs to be done little and often. And be realistic. Sometimes they say to children, oh, you need to start a vocabulary list, and they'll come back to me this week and they'll be like, I've learned 40 new words. But actually, that's not realistic, is it? Because, you know, they might have gone over 40 new words. They might have heard 40 new words, but they're not going to remember them all. So set realistic expectations. You know, 1 word a day is quite a lot when you've got 3 weeks into it, because that's 21 new words. If you're struggling with words, there are lots of 11 plus vocabulary lists. I think the key thing to be aware of is that any words can come up in the 11 plus, and so there is no full and total 11 plus vocabulary list. You can look at lots of different words, but there could be new words for your child, and there's very likely to be new words for your child. And don't try to cram lots of words out of context. A few other things that you can do is vocabulary flashcards. They can be really helpful, and if you can buy them online, or your child can make them at home with new words that they're learning, and they can draw pictures of words. That can be quite fun if they like annotating, and sometimes if they've drawn their own picture, then they remember the words a little bit better. And the other thing I was going to say is just different games. So Scrabble, Bobble, they're great. I volunteer in a primary school, and at the end of term I spent a whole session playing Bobble with a group of Year 5s, and they loved it. So I do really recommend that. Is there anything you'd like to add, Gemma? I think I can now hear you.
Hopefully. Can people hear me? I don't know.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Paul's kind of
Yeah, I can hear you, Gemma.
You can hear me. Okay, perfect.
Oh, Gemma's frozen now for me. Are you there, Gemma? Oh, do you want to go on the next slide? I can't. You just cut out for me a little bit there. Okay, so the next slide is grammar and punctuation. So there are a variety of things you can do with this. What I recommend first of all is make sure that your child is loud. I think it's quite tempting when your child becomes quite a fluent reader and you think, oh, you know, they're really good at reading now. It can be quite tempting just to allow them to read silently and listen to audiobooks, and you can kind of think, oh, you know, they enjoy reading, I don't need to get involved. I think it's really important, even as your child gets a little bit older, that you are still listening them to reading out loud, and you still read to them. So they do a bit of a mixture of reading aloud, reading silently, and listening to others read. This is really important because I think, you know, when they listen to others read, sometimes adults tend to go a little bit slower and read with a little bit more expression. And this then makes it more obvious where the punctuation is. Sometimes I find when children become quite fluent at reading, they read out loud and they just read really, really, really fast. And they don't pause where there are commas. They don't show you where there's an exclamation mark or a question mark. And then when they're writing, they get a little bit confused about which punctuation they need to use where. Whereas I think if you're really encouraging them to stand up, perform, you know, they don't have to perform every time they're reading, but if you say, oh, imagine you're reading to someone and, you know, they really, really need to get the feeling of what's going on, you need to read slowly, and that can really help with then their grammar and their punctuation, because they then know, you know, where the punctuation needs to go. Also check their pronunciation, that really helps when they're reading aloud as well. Tenses is a big one that I find happens with creative writing. You'll find that a child starts their story in the past tense, which usually if they're writing a story, I recommend starting, and then they'll switch to the present tense, and they'll switch to the past tense, switch to the present tense, and they won't realise that they're doing that. So I think reading aloud really, really focuses the child, and they realise when they shouldn't be switching tenses. If they're switching tenses in their creative writing, get them to read it aloud to you. I often recommend, once they've done some writing, to read it out loud, and then they often realise where they've gone wrong. When they're speaking, so just in everyday life, if they're speaking to you and they make a mistake with their tenses, then correct them, so that, you know, if they use the wrong word, or if it's an irregular verb and they put an ed on the end they shouldn't have done, correct them if you can. Audiobooks can help with this, particularly if you don't speak English at home or English isn't your first language. Then if you get them to listen to lots of audiobooks, that will really kind of help them with that exercise. one thing that I find really helps sometimes is punctuating paragraphs that don't have any punctuation in them. So find some paragraphs, there are lots online, and get them to put the punctuation in. I find that works better than just doing the test papers where they've got the punctuation in and you have to pick out where it's in incorrectly. If you get them to do lots of paragraphs and putting the punctuation in, that can really, really improve their writing, but also improve them on those other questions. Or get them to write a paragraph, take all the punctuation out, and then a couple of weeks later, give them that paragraph again that they've written and get them to repunctuate it. I recommend focusing on one area at a time. So if, for example, apostrophes is a struggle, children can get really confused with apostrophes. So explain how to do it, or get them to do a few exercises, leave it, and then revisit it, and focus on one area at a time. For spellings, there are lots of high frequency word lists online that you can find specifically for the 11 plus. Make sure that your child, if they get something wrong, they copy it, they cover it, and then they write it out themselves. And I recommend, again, doing little and often. So if they get something wrong, go back to it the next day, then leave it slightly longer, and then go back to it, so that you after a couple of weeks, you can be sure that they then know how to spell that word. If they're making lots of spelling errors in their creative writing, I think it's important to work out if it's them just being careless or if it's that they're not spelling them correctly. I often find that children will make spelling errors in the creative writing that they wouldn't make errors on if I just tested them on spellings. So what you need to do is you need to encourage your child to check their work and find their own errors. If they're not finding them, point out which sentence it's in and say, okay, there's an error in this sentence. Can you find the error? And often then they will be able to find it. Once they've found the error, or if you need to point out the exact word, then ask them to spell it. Because often I find if you point to the word and say, how do you spell that word? They'll give it another go and they'll get it right. So it's really important to work out whether it's carelessness or whether it's that they can't spell the word. I had a student a few weeks ago and I said, oh, I think you've made some errors and I think you can correct these yourself. And he said, oh, my teacher usually does that for me. Well, we need to get the children to be their own teacher. Once they've finished writing, they need to be the teacher and they need to be able to correct their own work. Is there anything that you'd like to add, Gemma?
Hopefully people can hear me now. So with that punctuating paragraphs, it kind of links with that reading aloud, in that every time they're taking a long pause, they should know that there's a full stop. Every time that they're taking a breath or that they're making a little pause, they should know. So try and link the reading and the punctuating together so that they can tell, okay, this is what a dash looks like in terms of speaking. This is what a colon looks like in terms of speaking. This is why I'd use it, because I've used it when I've performed stuff. And that's performance can be very, very useful for learning punctuation, because sometimes it seems like it's just a load of dashes on a page. But if you start to really think about, okay, there's a colon there, that's the reason that I'm starting a list, or this is the reason that I'm putting this piece of punctuation in, so that it can sound like this when I speak out loud. That can be quite useful with the knowing where to put punctuation, knowing where to put pauses, and also to tell when it's wrong, because if you can read it out loud and it sounds wrong in your head, then it's likely that there's some incorrect punctuation. All right, perfect. So one of the things that we kind of discussed was the idea of what happens when you're confused. So sometimes, and this is a rarity, but sometimes in the really, really competitive schools, they'll give you a text that is not a traditional fictional text. It could be a newspaper article, it could be a poem, it could be Shakespeare, it could be any of those types. And it can often make a child confused, because if they come across a word or a sentence that they don't necessarily understand, then sometimes they can just stop and they freeze and they don't understand the rest of the paragraph. So do think, and I think this has been mentioned before, about summarizing. So if you're working through tricky texts and they're struggling, then think about summarizing each paragraph, or why each paragraph is written. So I recently saw with a student, it was a newspaper article about aerial adventure, I think is what it was, and they meant it was like going through the city and going through on top of buildings, but they really struggled because there were some words there that they didn't understand and they froze. And what we did was work to summarize the paragraph and think about why it was written. If you're struggling with a sentence or a word, just miss it out, fill in your own one, and make sure that see whether there is something that can be missed out. And then the last thing that I kind of focus on when students are confused is the who, the what, the where, the when, the how. So if you can explain that about a text, you've pretty much got the gist of it. So who's involved, what's happening, where's it happening, when's it happening, and how are they doing it? Then you've got the kind of the original understanding of the text. And it's likely that a student will get stuck. There might be a tricky word in there. There might be a phrase that they've not heard of. There might be something that's accented in speech, and it can often read weirdly. But that confusing part, it's likely to only be a couple of marks, whereas freezing and panicking about it is going to cost more marks. So I'll always say to a student, look, miss it out, move through the sentence, and then try and work out what that might mean, as opposed to just stopping and freezing and not necessarily understanding.
Another thing I would say is that if there's a bit in bold at the top, make sure your child really, really focuses on that part in bold. Often they'll give you that because you'll have an extract and they're giving you some context. And sometimes I find children will quickly read that and then they'll get onto the main part because they think, oh, there's no questions about the bit in bold. The bit in bold is really, really key because that will probably tell you what's going on. So, I often say, if you're confused, read that a couple of times and that should really, really help you.
Yeah. And always focus on what can be answered as opposed to what can't be answered. So if there is a tricky word, that word might be in the multiple choice of like, what does it mean? But the rest of it is not about that one specific word. So if you focus on that one specific word, it will throw you for the rest of the text. But otherwise, if you just accept, okay, I'm going to guess what it means, or even I'm going to use the multiple choice and put it into that sentence to see if I know what it could mean, then you can move past and then you can focus on the rest.
Okay, so working on confidence. So the first thing I say is make sure you start your preparation in plenty of time. So we don't want cramming at the end. They're only 10, 11, and there's too much to cram at the end, and it's going to really, really put them off if they haven't done any preparation and suddenly you put a full test paper in front of them and they haven't covered half the topics. So you start your preparation in plenty of time. Make sure you work on the basics before doing any test papers. The child has covered all the topics, is kind of aware of the types of questions that's likely to come up. This is before doing any, formal test papers. So make sure you've done some, books or kind of practice questions before you go on to the formal test papers. Try and build things up in chunks. So as Gemma was saying earlier, if you put an hour paper in front of a child and there's half comprehension, half creative writing, and they haven't really done a test paper before, then they're going to find that quite tiring. So I would definitely suggest to start with, do the comprehension on one day, then leave it, and a day or 2 days later do the creative writing. And once they've got the hang of doing a test paper, then you can get them to do a whole paper. I recommend practicing test papers from a range of providers. So formats can change, the types of questions can change, and it can change last minute, and we don't want children to be put off because they're only used to doing test paper. So try and get some practice test papers from a range of providers so that your child feels confident and feels prepared for kind of anything that's thrown at them. Make sure if you're practicing test papers, make sure your child understands where they went wrong in one paper before they do the next paper. I think sometimes there can be the tendency to do as many papers as possible because you think, oh, then they've covered all the papers. and they know what they're doing. But actually, there's no point in doing lots of papers if they don't know exactly where they went wrong, and they make sure that they don't make that same mistake in the next paper. And I recommend going over questions that they've got wrong more than once. So, you know, I did this right up when I was doing GCSEs, A levels, university, law school. You know, if I got a question wrong in a past paper, I would flag it, and then I would read the answer. I would think, okay, I've got that. I do something else. I would then go back to it, and I would then, you know, right up to the exam, I would have flagged all the questions that I've ever got wrong. And I would need to make sure that I could cover the answer and I could answer that question perfectly.
We put it in a little book. So a
Yeah.
little book full of all the questions you got wrong. It's a perfect revision. It's your personalised revision.
Yeah, exactly. So make sure that your child really understands where they've gone wrong, and don't just go over it once. It's important that you keep going over it again and again until they feel really confident that they can answer that question perfectly. I recommend not doing lots of, you know, giving your child a score as soon as they start test papers. So, you know, if the child is not scoring, you know, really high marks, we don't want to be making them feel a bit demoralized by giving them their score. So, you know, obviously you'll want to know what their score is, but we don't need every single time that they've done anything or any book to be giving them a mark, where they can, you know, we want them to see where they've gone wrong, but they don't necessarily need the score. Obviously towards the end, then that can be really, really helpful, but not all the time. Make sure your child is clear what to expect when they go into the exam. So you might want to do a formal mock. Lots of tutors do formal mocks, or you might just want to do a mock at home where you get a past paper and they sit down somewhere quiet. They've got their watch, they've got their stationery, they've got their water, and it's as if it was in an exam condition. I do really recommend doing that either with a formal mock or just at home, just to make sure that they know what it's going to be like under pressure.
We also do a drive-by. So we recommend for parents to do the drive that you would do if you're taking the exam, because that way they know exactly what's going to happen on the day. Because ultimately everyone finds it a lot more relaxing if they know what's going to happen. So if they know that that's the drive you're going to do, or that's the train you're going to take, and where you're going to be whilst they're in the exam, what's going to happen when you pick them up, you don't have any worry around that stuff. So it's all being gone through.
Yeah, and try and get them excited rather than nervous. I know they're obviously naturally going to be nervous, but, you know, get them to visit the schools, the websites, do open days. I know some are online at the moment, but try and get them as excited as they can, because, you know, if they really, really want to go to a school, then, you know, they're going to put the work in and they're going to feel more confident. The obvious things like making sure they're sleeping, they're exercising, they're eating properly, and one other thing that I was going to say is just make sure that they're doing a range of other things. I know at the moment, particularly if your child has got exams in September, there'll be lots of pressure on doing, you know, lots and lots of work now. But we do need to make sure that they're still, they've got other hobbies and they've got other things to focus on. I think, you know, your child's whole self-worth can't be the exam. So, I mean, this is a real issue for lawyers, and is actually one of the reasons why I have my business and I do my lawyering. If something's not going well in one of them, I've got the other one as well. So, you know, if on the day your child feels like they haven't performed, they're not going to be too demoralized if they've got other focuses as well. We need to make sure that everything is not just the exam. And the more time that they spend focusing on the exam, the more they're going to feel like that. And the last thing is just be realistic with expectations. So, you know, they're only 10 or 11. You know, it's a struggle for adults to spend hours and hours every day revising or working. So, you know, we need to be realistic with what we can expect of them. And that kind of goes back to start preparation in plenty of time. You know, I can sometimes be a bit last minute with things. And I wouldn't be getting my child to do everything last minute.
Yeah. I think I know that Sheena and I have run a talk in the group before about like what to do the week before. So if you are a parent that's taking the exam, that should be on the videos. But things like talking to your child about what's going to happen if they haven't done a mock, so they know that there's going to be lots of other children. I work mine through like a visualization, so they visualize themselves going into the school, and they visualize themselves taking the paper, and they visualize themselves coming out and having tried their best and going off, and just purely that being able, getting your mind ready for it, can help any kind of last minute panics on the day. So really making sure that they are prepared on what to expect, and really that they know exactly what's going to happen, and that they're happy with what's going to happen. So they're not worrying, you know, am I going to be late, or what am I going to have for breakfast? Because those tiny things, they seem small and insignificant. They can make a big difference to a child, because if you've not got the right thing, it feels like it could all go wrong. So making sure that they know exactly what's happening, and they know that, you know, you don't just see them as that exam, but that you see them as a whole person, and that you are proud of how far they've come. And that would be the thing I'd be focusing on over the next month, is really looking at progress and showing them how far they've come, and look at how well you've done, and look at, you know, what you are achieving, and really focusing on how much they've learned, as opposed to necessarily focusing on the scores. As you said, you know, it doesn't need to be, you are now achieving this percent. It's, look, you've now mastered speech marks. You know how to use this. You know, this was really tricky when we first of all started, but you've really got it. So lots of praise, lots of encouragement over this last month. Really build them up. All right. Perfect. So I think we've hit about an hour. Hopefully, despite the slight speech issue halfway through, Fiona managed to carry on. So hopefully we have imparted some knowledge around English. As we said at the start, if you've got questions, write them in the chat, even if you're watching it on replay. And we can come and we can answer any questions that you have. One thing that, just before I'm aware, as it cut out, the thing that I was trying to put to the camera is, we've done a little book for our students, and it's got in it's around vocabulary. Let me see if I can find, here we are, it's got sentences where you fill in the gap. So this one here, where you would fill in the gap for the sentence. One of the things you were talking about was writing sentences and making sure that vocab is correct for the right sentence. So sometimes parents can, it's something you can do that's quite fun. You can write a sentence, they can find a word to fit in it, a bit like a jigsaw, but with words. So that was the last thing that I I needed to say based on that kind of dropping out. But thanks ever so much, Fiona, for coming on. And do you want to tell everybody how they can find you, contact you, all of those bits?
Yeah, so you can contact me on Facebook if you at Mills Tutoring, on LinkedIn, Fiona Mills, or just send me a message. You know, you should be able to find me. I'm one of the admin on the group now.
Perfect. And again, I always say this at the end, but thank you very much, Saba, for letting us come on and letting us talk to everybody on the 11 Plus journey. I'm sure people know I run the Education Hotel, so I can be found. I can be found at the Education Hotel, or I can be found by emailing myself. I am pretty much everywhere on the internet, so hopefully people can find me and find the Education Hotel. Somebody has asked about that vocab book. It's the first draft of that vocab book. It will very soon be available for other people, but it is currently just an our students internal one at the moment. In about 2 weeks, it will be something I'll be talking about, but it's just going through some final tweaks. Right. Perfect. So I think we're done. And yeah, thanks Fiona. Thanks to Saba. And thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.